The quartet had just slipped into a softer melody when the room seemed to lean toward the stage, crystal chandeliers flickering like they were holding their breath, and I felt the weight of every glance catch on the shape of my red satin dress. Grant was in his element, smiling with that measured charm he saved for judges and donors, one hand perched on the shoulder of the woman standing too close to his spotlight. I kept to the edge where the carpeting swallowed my footsteps, and the champagne tasted like patience watching the AV booth for the smallest nod. On the gift table lay a slim black envelope nestled between gold ribbons and heavy bows, so understated no one noticed it but me. The microphone waited, the timed lights dimmed one shade too low, and the air gathered itself the way it does before summer thunder. It would only take a raised glass to tilt the entire night into a new shape. Until then, I smiled like a woman who believed in every perfect thing she had built, and I let the music do the talking. Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and if stories about quiet justice keep you company at night, tap like and subscribe so you won't miss the rest. I was born in Macon to a school librarian who taught me the comfort of well-placed commas and a father who measured his love in repaired porch steps and steady paychecks. Kindness and composure were the family language. I married Grant at 26 because he seemed like the man who could make a life feel certain. He walked into rooms and people rearranged themselves around his confidence, a talent that dazzled me before I understood it. By the time Adam came along, we were living in a brick colonial on the edge of Savannah's historic streets, where magnolia leaves shined like dark coins and neighbors waved from slow-moving cars. My design work was selective and quiet. 2 projects at a time, a preference for natural light in rooms you could exhale in enough to keep my hands busy without competing with his calendar of depositions and dinners. We felt like a pair of polished bookends holding up a life full of travel photos, charity nights, and Sunday dinners where the conversation never raised its voice. Jenna flowed into our lives the way old friends do, through shared habits and easy laughter, always generous with compliments that landed like confetti and vanished before you could sweep them up. We'd met in our 20s at a crowded open house. She sold dreams and I arranged them, and for years that overlap passed for closeness. She had keys to the house, a favorite mug at my sink, and the kind of quick wit that made a room feel warmer, at least when I wanted to believe it. If she and Grant joked a shade too comfortably at the kitchen island, I told myself it was the familiarity of long friendships and the simple fact that old stories sound better told by the people who live them. I wanted our home to be the kind of place where the lights were always on and the table never felt full, and for a while, the illusion held. The harmony in our marriage had a pleasant rhythm. Coffee on the back steps at sunrise, 2 schedules compared, and smoothed kisses planted on cheeks when mornings ran fast. Evenings drifted between dinners downtown, and quiet hours spent on the couch, his tie draped over a chair, and my laptop half closed on a sketch. I fussed over table settings and playlists because it cost so little to make things lovely, and he collected praise like ivy climbing toward the sun. When small oddities appeared, I folded them into the regular noise of busy lives, the way he turned his phone face down during dessert, the new habit of showering just before bed, a missed call explained as work never sleeps. We told ourselves the same comforting story in different voices. We were fine, just tired, just busy, just grown. Still, there are sounds you don't forget even when you try to, and one of them is the brief, bright chime of a message landing when a house is otherwise still. It was a Saturday morning in late spring sunlight, laying squares across the kitchen floor, and Grant had stepped outside to wave a neighbor on. His phone lit where he'd left it by the coffee maker, a small rectangle of light that made the room suddenly colder, and I felt my breath shorten without understanding why. I didn't reach for it. I didn't move at all. I only watched the words gather on the glass like a whisper pressed to a door, and somewhere in the space between the first syllable and the next, I understood that the life I had arranged so carefully had just shifted quiet as a click. The words on that phone screen were brief, but they carried a weight I couldn't shake. Last night was dangerous, but I can't stop thinking about you. My chest tightened, as though someone had placed a stone inside me, heavy and unmoving. I stared at the message for only a few seconds, before the screen dimmed again, hiding the rest. By the time Grant walked back in, carrying the paper from the driveway, whistling a tune I didn't recognize, I had already forced my face into something neutral. I smiled as if the morning was ordinary, and he never noticed that my hands trembled slightly as I lifted my coffee cup. For the rest of that day, I studied him with a carefulness I had never used before. Every expression, every word, every glance at his phone became a clue to something I no longer wanted to ignore. He laughed a little too easily when I asked about his schedule, brushing off details with a wave of his hand. "Client emergency," he said, the phrase landing flat against the air like a receipt dropped carelessly on a table. It became his favorite explanation, tossed out whenever he needed to disappear for the evening. At first I told myself that long marriages collect secrets in the corners, little things that don't matter. But the nights out grew longer, and the explanations thinner, and soon his habits shifted in ways that were hard to disguise. He began showering late at night, not after coming home from work, but before climbing into bed beside me. The scent of unfamiliar cologne clung faintly to his skin, sharp and out of place. His phone, once left on the counter without thought, now traveled with him from room to room, tucked into his pocket, even when he stepped outside to water the plants. The breaking point came on a warm Friday in May, when I woke at 2 a.m. with a restless unease that felt like it had been building for weeks. I reached for my laptop and opened our shared credit card account, a habit I had never really needed before. My breath caught when I saw a charge for $642 at the Magnolia Inn, time-stamped just hours earlier. The hotel wasn't in Charleston, where he claimed to be for a deposition, but right here in Savannah, no more than 15 minutes away. My hands were steady as I wrote down the room number given by the clerk, who hesitated only until I showed my driver's license and said, "I'm his wife." The hallway carpet muffled my steps as I walked toward room 214, the silence broken only by the low hum of the air conditioning. I knocked once, then twice, and the shuffle of movement inside told me I had been right to come. The door opened just a crack before Jenna's face appeared. Her hair tousled a silk robe tied carelessly around her waist. She froze when she saw me, her eyes widening first with shock, then narrowing with something like defiance. Behind her, Grant scrambled to gather his clothes, his shirt half-buttoned, his expression caught between panic and anger. The smell of perfume and spilled wine floated out into the hallway, mingling with the scent of betrayal that was too thick to breathe. I stepped past the threshold just enough to let my eyes sweep over the scene, the unmade bed, the room's service tray, his tie abandoned on the floor beside her shoes. My voice came out calm, almost cold. "Well, I said this explains the client emergencies." Grant's face drained of color as he stammered, "Lauren, let's talk about this." Jenna crossed her arms and lifted her chin. "You don't own him," she said, her voice low, like she had been waiting for this moment. I held her gaze until she looked away, then turned and walked back down the hallway. My heels clicked against the carpet in measured beats, not rushed, not shaken. I didn't slam the door behind me. I didn't need to. On the drive home, the tears came hard and fast, blurring the streetlights into streaks of silver. By the time I pulled into our driveway, the sobs had run dry, leaving behind only the sharp edge of humiliation. That night, I lay awake listening to the quiet tick of the clock on the nightstand, each second pressing heavier against my chest. For a brief moment, I considered leaving. I thought about packing a bag, calling an attorney, and walking away from the wreckage of what we had built. There was a strange freedom in imagining it, a life where I no longer had to endure the lies, or the hollow excuses. But then I thought about the years I had poured into this marriage, the trust I had given the home I had made steady for our son, and the face Grant wore when he believed he had outsmarted me. No, I decided walking away would only confirm what they both already believed, that I was too gentle to fight back, too loyal to ever become dangerous. That night, something shifted inside me. The grief burned away until all that remained was clarity, a cold calm that steadied my breath and kept my hands from shaking. They had planned this, nurtured it, carried it out under my roof and at my table, believing I would never see. And in that moment, I promised myself that I wouldn't just leave them to their choices. I would show them what it meant to be underestimated. When Grant returned the next morning, still smelling faintly of mint and cologne, he acted as if nothing had happened. He set his briefcase on the counter, kissed the top of my head, and said, "Morning. Busy day ahead, we'll talk later." I nodded, my expression as smooth as porcelain, and he walked out the door, believing the worst was over. He thought silence meant surrender, that I would swallow my humiliation and carry on as if nothing had broken. But while he walked down the driveway, I was already making a list in my mind. The first item was simple: find their weaknesses. His law practice depended on his reputation, on the faith of his clients, and the respect of judges who valued integrity above all else. One well-placed rumor, one scandal confirmed, and his empire would crack. For Jenna, appearances were her currency. In luxury real estate, where confidentiality and discretion were everything, a single hint of impropriety could close doors she had spent years prying open. The second item: collect evidence. They had been careless hotel charges, text messages, stolen moments in public places. Proof was already in reach if I only paid attention. The third item was timing. Grant's 50th birthday was only 3 months away, and he had been planning the celebration for nearly a year. The guest list was filled with every person whose opinion he cared about: clients, colleagues, family, friends, and of course Jenna. If there was ever a stage for truth, it would be that ballroom under the chandeliers he adored. As the thought settled, I felt the pieces click into place like a lock turning smoothly under the right key. That morning, I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee and opened my planner as if the day were no different than any other. But I knew the truth now, and with every tick of the clock, my silence wasn't surrender, it was preparation. The path ahead was already forming, and all I needed was patience to see it through. And as I sat at the kitchen table with the morning light slanting across the floor, I knew with certainty that the first crack had opened wide, and there was no going back. The night after finding them together, I sat in the darkness of our bedroom, long after the house had gone still. Grant's side of the bed was empty, his pillow cool, and the silence pressed against me like a weight. I stared at the ceiling, tracing the shadows of the ceiling fan, unable to close my eyes without seeing the hotel hallway, Jenna's robe, his shirt, half open. Tears came until there were no more, and what remained was an ache deeper than crying could reach. I felt hollow and wide awake, wondering how many nights before this one had been filled with the same deceit, while I lay here, believing we were steady. In the morning, I went through the motions as though nothing had shifted. I brewed coffee, set a plate of toast on the table, and straightened the mail into neat piles. Grant breezed in, kissed the top of my head, and grabbed his briefcase without noticing my hands curled tight around my mug. "Busy day. We'll talk tonight," he said, and then he was gone, leaving behind the faint trace of cologne that no longer belonged to me. I sat at the table listening to the echo of the door closing, the quiet stretching until it became unbearable. Adam was still asleep upstairs, the rhythm of his life undisturbed. I couldn't bring him into this, not yet. To him, his father was the man who showed up at basketball games and knew the best shortcuts across town. The thought of shattering that image made me hold my tongue, even as my heart begged to scream. I folded laundry instead, my hands shaking when I smoothed one of Grant's shirts, the same brand he had worn at the hotel. The fabric smelled faintly of starch and aftershave, and I wanted to tear it in half, but I pressed it neatly and placed it in the drawer like nothing was wrong. That week, the pain became a constant companion. At night, I lay awake beside him, listening to the soft rhythm of his breathing, wondering if it was the same sound Jenna had fallen asleep to. I replayed the moments I had missed, the signs I had brushed aside her hand on his arm, at parties, their laughter in the kitchen, the phone turned face down on the counter. Every memory was a cut that reopened itself with the smallest thought. In public, I smiled. I hosted a dinner for his colleagues and passed wine glasses without letting my hands tremble. I laughed at stories, tucked my hair behind my ear, and pretended to be the woman everyone expected. Inside, I was crumbling. I caught sight of myself in the mirror one afternoon and almost didn't recognize the woman staring back. My eyes looked tired, the skin around them drawn from nights without rest. I touched the frame with my fingertips and whispered, "Hold it together," though no one else was there to hear. Holding it together became my only task. I dressed carefully, applied makeup with precision, and kept every detail of our home polished so no one could glimpse the storm beneath the surface. Sometimes, Jenna called her voice cheerful, pretending to be the friend she had once been. She spoke of open houses, difficult clients, and the latest neighborhood gossip as if the hotel room never happened. I listened quietly, nodding though she couldn't see me answering with short words that kept her from noticing the ice forming between us. When she hung up, I sat in the kitchen staring at the phone, the urge to throw it across the room tightening my chest. But instead, I placed it gently on the counter. The anger wasn't ready yet. The grief still needed its place. At night, when Grant said he was working late, I walked through the house touching familiar things. The framed photographs lining the hallway told the story we once lived, vacations by the ocean, Christmas mornings, Adam's first steps. My hand lingered on the glass of one frame where Grant's smile looked genuine, the kind of smile that had once drawn me in. I wondered when it had become practiced, when it had turned into the mask he now wore so easily. The photographs remained unchanged, but I knew better. They were just snapshots of a life that no longer existed. The isolation became its own kind of prison. I wanted to tell someone to release the words into air that could hold them for me, but I knew too well how quickly stories travel in our circle. I could not risk whispers before I was ready. Instead, I carried the knowledge alone, folding it deeper into myself until it became part of my posture, part of every careful word I spoke. The silence hurt, but it was safer than exposing the wound before I knew how to protect it. There were nights when I nearly reached for his arm, ready to ask why, ready to demand the truth that was already plain. But the thought of hearing him justify it, of watching him twist the words until they no longer resembled reality, stopped me. I swallowed the questions and turned to my side, staring into the dark, until morning light seeped through the blinds. That restraint, though it burned, gave me time. And with time, I began to see that grief was not the end. Beneath the tears and the sleepless nights, something steadier was forming. One afternoon, I sat in the garden, pulling weeds from the flower bed, my hands sinking into the damp soil. The earth was cool against my palms, grounding me in a way nothing else had. I realized then that my silence had been misunderstood. Grant believed it meant defeat. Jenna likely thought it meant she had won. But what they couldn't see was that silence can hold its own strength. It could be a waiting place, a gathering of power rather than its loss. The pain hadn't left me. It still lived in my chest, heavy and sharp, but alongside it grew a calm that surprised me. Each day I managed to smile through the ache. I felt the faintest stirrings of control returning. I wasn't ready to act, not yet, but I was learning how to stand without collapsing, how to face the mirror and see more than brokenness. The nights of tears were not gone, but they came less often. When they did, I let them fall, and then I wiped them away and began again. In those quiet hours when the house was still and the clock ticked softly, I whispered to myself that this wasn't the end, not for me. And as spring deepened, I knew the time was coming when grief would no longer be enough. Soon, the pain would give way to something sharper, something that carried a different kind of weight. The morning sunlight spilled through the blinds, drawing pale stripes across the floorboards as I sat at the kitchen table, my planner open but untouched. The grief that had weighed me down for weeks was still there, but it had shifted, hardened into something steadier. I traced the rim of my coffee mug with one finger, realizing I could not let their betrayal define the rest of my days. Walking away might have been easier, but it would also hand them the victory they thought they had already won. For the first time, I saw clearly that leaving quietly was not an option. I began studying Grant the way I used to study clients when I designed a room. Every word, every gesture, every careless look became a piece of a larger picture. He had always relied on me to smooth over the rough edges, to play the role of the gracious wife who kept things in order while he reached for recognition. That skill of mine, the one he mistook for compliance, was now the same one I would use to take him apart. I realized I had been preparing for this moment my entire marriage. I just hadn't known it. One evening, I stood in the doorway of his study, watching him bent over a stack of papers. He was rehearsing a closing argument, pacing as he spoke the lines to himself. Glass of bourbon balanced carelessly on the desk. Once, I would have admired his focus, but now I only saw how predictable he had become. He looked smaller to me, not in size, but in presence, as though the pedestal I had placed him on had finally crumbled. I turned away before he noticed me, went upstairs, and began organizing the files I had been quietly gathering. I had proof scattered in drawers and folders, snippets of bank statements, emails, and photographs I had snapped when opportunity allowed. As I sorted them into a neat stack, I felt the same calm that comes when a design plan finally clicks together. This wasn't rage anymore. Rage was too messy. This was precision. It was strategy. It was knowing I didn't have to scream to be heard. I only needed to choose the right moment. The turning point came when I remembered a small detail Grant had forgotten about his laptop. He often left it open on the kitchen counter when he was home, moving between calls and case notes without a thought. One afternoon, while he showered, I noticed the screen glowing and sat down in front of it. I didn't snoop out of impulse. I moved with intention. Within minutes, I had synced his calendar to an old tablet tucked away in my design studio. The dates and notes appeared instantly, giving me access to every meeting, every trip, every dinner planned in the months ahead. He never realized the mirror image of his schedule now belonged to me. It wasn't enough to know where he was. I needed leverage, something undeniable that couldn't be twisted into excuses. I remembered his old law firm login, the one he once said was wiped clean. On a whim, I tried it, and to my surprise, it still worked. Emails appeared casual exchanges that confirmed late dinners with Jenna were no coincidence. I saved them one by one, tucking them into a folder only I could see. Proof was building quietly, almost too easily, and I began to understand how careless they had both become. But I didn't stop there. I called in a favor from an old acquaintance, a private investigator I had once hired on behalf of a client who needed background checks before purchasing a property. He didn't ask why I wanted photos of Grant's dinners or Jenna's late-night meetings. Money and discretion spoke more loudly than curiosity. Within weeks, I had a collection of photographs, grainy images of them slipping into restaurants, sitting too close in quiet corners, and walking together under streetlights like they owned the night. It was enough to tarnish them separately, but I wanted more. I wanted the kind of evidence that would bring both of their worlds crashing down at once. That's when I thought of his 50th birthday. Grant had been planning it for months, obsessing over details, curating the guest list as if it were a courtroom lineup. Every person who mattered to him, clients, colleagues, investors, family would be there. And Jenna, of course, wouldn't miss it for the world. If there was ever a stage for truth, that ballroom would be it. I started to see the night not as a celebration, but as a theater, and I would control the script. The clarity gave me strength. I still felt the ache of betrayal, but it no longer consumed me. I began to move through each day with a new steadiness, hiding my intentions behind soft smiles and gentle words. To anyone watching, I was the same wife I had always been asking about his cases, inviting Jenna to brunch, pretending the surface was still unbroken. Inside, though, I was no longer the woman who lay awake in tears. I was a woman preparing for war, quietly and carefully. Each time Grant brushed past me with barely a glance. Each time Jenna smiled at me with that hint of triumph in her eyes, I felt my resolve sharpen. They believed they were untouchable. They thought my silence meant surrender. But they couldn't see what was taking shape beneath it, couldn't sense that I was gathering strength in the shadows. My silence was not weakness. It was the countdown to something they would never forget. And as spring drifted towards summer, I knew the time for grieving was over. I had studied them long enough. The next step was mine to take, and I would not waste it. The days after my decision took on a different rhythm. Outwardly, life looked the same. I still moved through the house in soft slippers, still asked Adam about his classes, still listened when Grant launched into half-hearted stories about his work. But underneath every action carried a hidden current. I was no longer the wife waiting for honesty that would never come. I was the architect of something deliberate, each detail designed to fit into place when the time came. My first step was quiet, almost invisible. While Grant showered one evening, I opened his laptop and checked the calendar I had synced to my tablet weeks before. The entries revealed more than meetings and court dates. They confirmed the pattern of his evenings, the dinners disguised as business, and the trips that never left town. Having the information felt like holding a map that no one else knew existed. It gave me freedom to plan without guessing. I began creating folders on my tablet, each one carefully labeled with dates and times. Inside, I stored photographs Dennis had delivered in a plain envelope, grainy snapshots of Grant and Jenna sitting too close at a restaurant table, another of them entering a hotel together, heads bent, as if sharing a secret. I studied those images in silence, my heart no longer racing with grief, but steady with purpose. Proof was not just a shield, it was a weapon. Emails were next. The old login I had uncovered still worked, and I combed through the exchanges one by one. Some were short, simple lines like dinner after court. Others carried more weight, booked the suite again, same as last time. Each message was like a puzzle piece snapping into place, building a picture they could never deny. I saved everything, printing hard copies and storing them in a plain manila folder hidden in the back of my design studio closet. There were close calls. One afternoon, Jenna stopped by, unannounced, her voice carrying through the hallway before I could hide the papers spread across my desk. I slipped the folder into a drawer just as she entered, her heels clicking on the hardwood. Working on another penthouse, she asked, her eyes flicking briefly toward the desk. I smiled, showing her fabric swatches I had pulled from a shelf. "Yes, clients who can't decide between cool or warm tones," I said, talking fast enough to redirect her attention. She stayed for only a few minutes, but my pulse didn't calm until her car pulled away from the driveway. Another time, Grant suggested a spontaneous lunch downtown. I knew his sudden gestures were meant to reassure me, but I also knew my phone, with every incriminating file, was unlocked in my purse. When I returned from the restroom, I caught him glancing at it, his expression too smooth. He hadn't opened anything, but it was a warning. That night, I locked the device with a new code he could never guess. I reminded myself that revenge demanded precision, not accidents. I practiced restraint as carefully as I practiced my lines in front of the mirror. Late at night, when the house was still, I stood in front of my reflection, rehearsing the words I would speak when the moment arrived. I tested the tone of my voice, calm and deliberate, the way a designer presents a finished plan rather than a plea for understanding. I adjusted my posture, the way I would hold a glass, the timing of each pause. This would not be a scene of shouting or chaos. It would be measured and devastating. Finances became my next focus. Through the bank statements I had quietly collected, I saw the gaps in Grant's empire, debts tucked beneath polished surfaces, loans leaning against promises of future cases. He was walking a line thinner than he wanted anyone to know. I spoke to a mutual friend in finance, asking careful questions under the guise of curiosity, and confirmed what I suspected. Without a particular deal he was negotiating, the cracks in his practice would widen into collapse. I didn't need to break that deal myself. I only had to plant the right doubts. A discreet phone call to one of his potential investors was enough to stir hesitation, and within days, the opportunity slipped away from him. The bankruptcy filing appeared shortly after. I found it online, public and undeniable, and printed it on heavy paper. I slipped the pages into a black envelope and placed it with the rest of my evidence. It was not meant for him yet. It was meant for the night when silence would finally shatter. By June, my closet held more than clothes. It had become a command center, an evidence board pinned with red string, and notes marking every movement, every lie. The date of Grant's 50th birthday sat in the center, circled in gold ink. Around it, photographs, receipts, and email printouts formed a pattern so clear it no longer even hurt to see. It looked less like a marriage unraveling and more like a blueprint for demolition. Outwardly, I remained steady. I invited Jenna to brunch one Sunday, letting her chatter about a waterfront listing while she checked her phone beneath the table. I nodded politely, sipping my tea, all the while imagining the look on her face when her client saw the photographs I had tucked away. Each interaction with her, each casual conversation with Grant, felt like part of a rehearsal. They believed they were winning. They believed I had chosen silence because I was too weak to confront them. The truth was simpler. My silence was the sound of a fuse burning steady and invisible, inching closer to its mark. I didn't need to rush. They were handing me everything I required, careless in their confidence. Every late-night dinner, every hotel charge, every message left sitting on his phone became another match in my hand. And as the summer air grew heavy with magnolia blooms and the days shortened toward July, I knew the countdown was nearly complete. The stage had been set. All that remained was to decide exactly how the curtain would rise. The night of Grant's 50th arrived with the kind of polish he had always craved. The Whitmore ballroom glowed beneath crystal chandeliers, each table draped in ivory linen and circled with silver-backed chairs. Guests mingled in clusters, their laughter floating above the music of a hired quartet. Waiters wove through the crowd, balancing trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres, every detail designed to reinforce the image Grant had cultivated for decades. I slipped into the room quietly, the red satin dress I had chosen, drawing glances but no questions, and nodded once to Kyle at the AV booth. Our signal was set. Grant moved through the crowd like a conductor, shaking hands, clapping shoulders, exchanging practiced jokes that drew polite laughter. Jenna hovered nearby, the perfect shadow, dressed in a gown that shimmered under the lights. To anyone else, her presence might have looked harmless, just a longtime family friend supporting him on his milestone night. But I watched the flicker in her eyes when she leaned close to him, the way her smile held more triumph than affection. They thought I was there to play the dutiful wife, smiling on the sidelines. They had no idea the room was already in my hands. The evening unfolded with speeches and toasts, each one carefully orchestrated. His brother raised a glass to childhood memories, colleagues spoke of victories in court, and acquaintances praised his generosity. Applause rose and fell like the tide, and still I waited. When the master of ceremonies finally announced, "And now a special tribute from Grant's wife," the room hushed. I walked slowly to the stage, heels clicking against the polished floor, every movement deliberate. Grant smiled up at me, the kind of smile he used to mask nerves before a trial, and Jenna straightened in her seat. I held the microphone lightly, letting the silence stretch just long enough. My voice when I spoke was warm but steady. 50 years is no small milestone, I said, my gaze moving across the tables. Grant has built a career and friendships that many would envy. Tonight, I thought it only fitting that we all share in what these years have truly given us. I raised my champagne glass toward the AV booth, and Kyle's fingers moved over the console. The lights dimmed. The first image filled the towering screen behind me. It was not the family photograph Grant expected. Instead, a grainy shot of him and Jenna entering the Magnolia Inn appeared, his hand resting at her waist. A ripple moved through the room. The next slide followed the two of them in an elevator, her head tipped toward his shoulder. Then came the photographs Dennis had gathered, clearer and sharper dinners in dim corners, hands entwined across a table, a kiss exchanged as if the world weren't watching. Conversations broke off mid-sentence, replaced by gasps and murmurs. The air shifted the way it does when a storm breaks overhead. Grant half rose from his chair, his face pale in the glow of the screen. "Lauren," he began, but I cut him off before he could gather his words. "No," I said firmly into the microphone, my eyes holding his. "You don't decide when enough is enough." Jenna's hand trembled as she gripped the edge of her chair. Her painted smile long gone. The screen shifted again, revealing the text messages. "Booked the suite again, same as last time. You always make me feel like I'm the only one in the room." Each timestamp told its own story. The room was silent, except for the shuffling of a few chairs and the soft hum of the projector. I walked to the gift table and picked up the slim black envelope waiting among gold-wrapped boxes. Holding it in one hand, I turned back toward Grant. "And because birthdays deserve gifts," I said evenly, "here are the finalized bankruptcy filings you thought you could keep hidden until after tonight." I slid the papers across the table to him, the embossed seal catching the light. Gasps rippled again, sharper this time, and I caught sight of two of his partners exchanging looks that bordered on panic. Jenna tried to stand, her face flushed with heat, but the screen behind me lit again. This time, it was a photograph of her inside a client's home, identifiable by the unique furnishings, a watermark from a gossip column stamped in the corner. The timing was perfect. I had sent it in days earlier. A couple at her table stiffened, one pulling out their phone to type quickly. I let my gaze sweep over the room. You've both built your lives on appearances? I said, my voice calm, but unyielding. But once appearances shatter, no one ever sees you the same way again. I stepped closer to their table, the microphone catching even the softness of my words. This isn't just here. It's everywhere. Grant's head snapped up, eyes narrowing, but I continued without pause. The files and the video were sent this morning to every client, every partner, every contact you've both worked so hard to impress. They already know. His phone buzzed on the table once, then again, then a third time in quick succession. He didn't reach for it. He sat rigid, his jaw locked, while Jenna's eyes darted frantically around the room, searching for someone to defend her. No one moved. The party dissolved in slow waves. Guests rose quietly, collecting coats and purses, their eyes averted as if they couldn't bear to be caught staring. The quartet packed their instruments without a word. Conversations swelled only in hushed tones at the edges of the room. Grant sat frozen, the bankruptcy papers in his hand, his face drained of color. Jenna remained beside him, her shoulders stiff, her lipstick smudged at the corners. They looked less like people celebrating a milestone and more like statues abandoned in the middle of a stage. I picked up my clutch from a nearby chair and turned toward the exit. Halfway to the door, I paused and looked back. "And Grant," I said softly, though the microphone carried the words through the room. "The house. The one you leveraged for your debts. I bought the lien last week. You have 30 days to leave." The sound that followed was not applause, not even outrage, but silence that seemed to echo louder than anything else. I walked out into the warm Savannah night, the murmurs trailing behind me like the closing notes of a requiem. The ballroom had been their kingdom, but in a single hour, it had turned into their downfall. And as I stepped into the humid night air, I knew the demolition had only begun. The fallout began before dawn. I didn't seek out the headlines or the whispers they found me. A former client forwarded me a screenshot of an email severing ties with Grant's firm. The words "effective" immediately underlined for emphasis. By noon, a photograph of the Savannah Journal front page lit my phone. Local attorney faces bankruptcy amid scandal. I stared at the image for a long moment before setting it aside. The demolition had begun, and I hadn't lifted another finger. By evening, Grant's partners had called an emergency meeting without him. The words reached me through a mutual acquaintance, followed by the phrase "on leave," a polite way of saying exile. His name, once spoken with deference in courtrooms and cocktail parties, was now whispered as a cautionary tale. The same men who had once leaned on him for his sharp arguments now refused to answer his calls. Doors that had always opened for him were suddenly closed. Jenna's fall came just as swiftly. Within 24 hours, her broker had quietly dropped her, unwilling to gamble the firm's reputation on a woman whose name was plastered across gossip columns. Her carefully nurtured clients stopped answering her messages, appointments dissolved without explanation, and the listings she had boasted about over brunch were reassigned to others. A gossip headline read, "From open houses to closed doors," and though brutal, it was accurate. Her livelihood, built on charm and trust, slipped away before she could gather her footing. I didn't need to seek revenge anymore. It was unraveling on its own, pulled loose by threads they had woven themselves. 2 weeks later, I received official notice confirming the lien transfer on the house. The letter gave Grant 30 days to vacate. That night, he called me. His voice was unsteady, bourbon curling around the edges of his words. "Lauren," he said, "you've made your point. Let's work this out privately." I listened, letting the silence stretch until he grew uncomfortable. Then I told him there was nothing left to negotiate. The papers had been filed. It was no longer personal. It was business. He didn't call again. Jenna tried once. She appeared at my doorstep, dressed carefully, though the cracks showed in the dark circles beneath her eyes, and the weight she had lost. She asked to come in, her voice thin with strain. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. "We should talk," she said, her tone carrying a note of desperation. I shook my head. "Talking was a luxury you wasted the night you chose him," I answered. Her lips trembled as she accused me of ruining her. I told her calmly that she had ruined herself. I had only turned on the light so others could see. She left without looking back. The following month brought the annual spring charity gala. I went alone this time, wearing a dress in soft navy, simple but elegant. When I entered the ballroom, heads turned, not with pity as I had once feared, but with something closer to respect. People I barely knew leaned in to tell me they admired my strength, that they had heard what happened, and were moved by how I carried myself. I smiled, thanked them, and held my glass with steady hands. I realized then that scandal, when faced without flinching, doesn't just break you, it can also raise you higher. When the time came for Grant to leave the house, I walked through it one last time. The rooms echoed without the weight of his presence, the study half empty except for a stack of case files and tucked behind them a small wooden box. Inside were photographs, our honeymoon in Santorini, Adam's first birthday, a Christmas tree glowing in our first apartment. For a moment, my breath caught, and I felt something like regret. But I closed the lid and left it there. Some memories are best left to gather dust, untouched by the present. What Grant and Jenna never knew was that I had held back the sharpest blade. Weeks earlier, when I synced his calendar, I had also stumbled upon a string of emails with a state tax auditor. The exchanges revealed he had been quietly shifting funds, moving numbers to cover personal expenses. I hadn't needed that information to expose the affair, but I had kept it waiting for the right moment. 2 days after he handed over the house keys, I sent the emails and supporting bank statements to the auditor. 3 weeks later, word spread that Grant had been indicted for tax fraud. His license to practice law was suspended pending investigation, his career dismantled, not with noise, but with a quiet signature on a legal notice. Jenna's final blow came from another direction. The same gossip column that had run her photo published an audio clip of her voice laughing as she boasted about taking Grant and mocking me by name. I hadn't leaked it directly. I had simply ensured it found its way into the hands of her fiercest competitor, a rival who wasted no time making it public. Within days, the recording circulated through every client chat group she had ever relied on. Whatever shred of her reputation remained collapsed overnight. The last time I saw them was by chance. I was leaving a cafe downtown when I noticed them at an outdoor table a block away. Grant looked smaller somehow. His suit wrinkled, his hair unkempt. Jenna sat rigid beside him, staring at her phone with frustration etched across her face. They didn't speak, didn't touch. They looked like two people clinging to the last piece of wreckage after the ship had already sunk. I didn't stop. I didn't even let them see me. I walked past, leaving them in their silence, and carried the knowledge that they would never escape the shadow of what they had done. Justice hadn't come through shouting or violence. It had arrived quietly, piece by piece, until the life they had built on arrogance collapsed under its own weight. And as I watched the sun filter through the trees on that warm afternoon, I knew their downfall was complete. The last time I saw Grant and Jenna, they looked like shadows of themselves, worn down and silent, seated at a cafe table that held no conversation. I walked past without turning my head, leaving them in the ruins they had made together. For the first time in a long while, I felt light, as if the burden I had carried in silence had finally lifted from my shoulders. Justice hadn't been loud or chaotic. It had been deliberate, each piece falling into place until there was nothing left of the lives they had once flaunted. In the weeks that followed, I found a steadier rhythm. I returned to my design work with a new clarity, pouring myself into spaces that invited peace instead of appearances. Adam grew taller, seemingly overnight, and I made sure he felt the security of a home that didn't tremble beneath secrets. We didn't speak often of his father, but when we did, I told him the truth gently, not to wound him, but so he would understand that even the strongest walls can crack when built on deception. Walking through the house after Grant left, I realized it no longer felt like his. The rooms breathed differently lighter without the weight of his presence. In the study, the photographs he had left behind remained untouched. I never threw them away. I simply let them sit, gathering dust reminders of a life that had ended long before the night it came crashing down in public. Some memories don't need to be destroyed, they fade quietly when you no longer feed them with energy. What stayed with me most wasn't the scandal itself, but the lesson inside it. For years, I believed silence meant weakness, that keeping the peace was the only way to survive betrayal. But I learned that silence, when chosen carefully, can be strength. It can be the stillness before a storm, the calm before the truth is revealed. And once truth steps into the light, it does not leave room for lies to stand. Grant and Jenna lost everything because they built their lives on appearances and arrogance. I did not need to shout or fight or lower myself to their level. All I had to do was place the pieces they handed me in the right order and let the truth speak louder than any excuse they could invent. In the end, their downfall wasn't mine to carry. It was the natural weight of their own choices. As for me, I came away not broken, but restored. I held my head high when I walked into rooms again, and the pity I feared never came. Instead, people met me with respect, and in time I realized that the dignity I thought I had lost had never truly left me. It was waiting for me to claim it back. Life has a way of showing us what matters once the noise fades. For me, it wasn't revenge alone, though. I won't deny the satisfaction of watching them fall. It was knowing that I could survive betrayal without losing myself, that I could face devastation and still choose to walk forward with calm and grace. So now when I look back, I don't see just the pain. I see the strength that grew from it, the resilience that carried me through, and the quiet justice that proved louder than any celebration they ever held. Before we close, I'd love to know which part of this journey spoke most to you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you'd like to hear more stories of truth, justice, and resilience, you'll always find them here.